Group, could you tell me your topic?
Asylums.
All right, Dana, Abby, Melissa, are you ready?
Yep.
And proceed.
For those of you who don't know, I like to eat a lot. And I also have the nickname Double Extra Dana given to me at lunch because I like to eat double extras. Now, when I go around eating 4 hamburgers, a lot of people like to say, oh, hey, you're eating 4 hamburgers, you're eating 8 Bosco sticks, you're crazy. Well, maybe I am crazy, but back in those days, I would have been actually considered crazy and been put in a mental asylum. A brief history on asylums. In the 1700s, patients with mental illnesses were simply housed and not cured. And in the 1800s, they were promised kind treatments, but that didn't exactly happen. In 1841, Thomas Kirkbride invented the Kirkbride Plan. Thomas Kirkbride, the influential medical superintendent of the Institution of Pennsylvania Hospital, developed what quickly became known as the Kirkbride Plan for how hospitals devoted to moral treatments should be built and organized. This plan, the prototype for many future and public insane asylums, called for no more than 250 patients living in a building with a central core and long rambling rings arranged to provide sunlight and fresh air as well as privacy and comfort. The University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, 2015. Now this doesn't actually sound that bad, but it never actually happened. In the 1850s, a woman on a field trip with her students to a jail noticed that a lot of mentally ill patients were being treated very horribly in these jails. And so, Dorothea Dix, under the influence of the Kirkbride Plan, made her very own mental asylum. But in the 1890s, a lot of mental asylums, both in the UK and in the US, experienced a lot of corruption. The people who admitted these mentally ill patients noticed that if they admitted people who weren't mentally ill, they could save money on nursing homes. They could put people in asylums that weren't actually crazy just to keep them quiet. And in the 1930s, the World War II economic crisis struck and the corruption became even worse. With more money being lost, they needed ways to save money. In the 1950s, asylums finally began to reform. Now there are a lot of reasons people were admitted into asylums back in those days. For actual mental illnesses such as ADD, ADHD, schizophrenia, also indigestion, being overheated, having a fever, being lazy, imbecility, a dog bite, or even jealousy. As such, if a woman was to behave in a way that opposed the views or opinions held by her husband, the husband would then declare the wife insane and have her sent to an asylum rather than going through a divorce as the majority of couples would do in modern times. Cassidy Jean Charles, September 23, 2013. So if a woman just opposed her husband, the husband's like, oof, done, she goes to an asylum. That's just how it worked back then. That's how everything worked back then. Mental illness was seen as a moral failing rather than a sickness. Frankie Goodway, November 27, 2013. A study was done in this year to see how many patients had an actual curable disease in the UK. In 1844, there were about 4,244 patients in asylums, but only 15% of these patients had a curable disease. In 1860, there were 17,432 patients, but there were only 11% curable. And in 1870, there were 27,890 patients, but only 8% of these patients had a curable mental illness. Now, there are a lot of laws made in these times. In 1808, the County Asylums Act was passed, and this was because before that, a lot of families just had private madhouses. They would keep their mentally ill in their house in a small room. The County Asylums Act was made so that legally houses could bring in there could be public houses made for the mentally ill. In 1828, the Madhouse Act was passed, and this was so the Lunatic Commission could inspect these madhouses and private houses so that everything was okay. In 1845, the Lunatic Asylum Act was passed, and this was so it was mandatory for every town, county, and city to have a public asylum. Local governments could avoid the cost of caring for the elderly residents in almshouses or public hospitals by redefining what was then termed senility as a psychiatric problem and sending these men and women to state-supported asylums. Patricia D'Antonio, 2015. Now there are a lot of stories I found of wrongful incarceration among these asylums, but the one that personally to me stuck out the most was the one of Mariquita Sargent. And she was admitted to Sunbury Asylum in 1945 because she had 5 kids at the time, and nowadays 5 kids is considered to be a lot-ish. And so her husband wanted to have more kids, and she didn't want to have any more, and so he sent her to an asylum. And so she wrote the governor of this town and stated that she was not insane and that she was unjustly detained. And the governor wrote back saying, this person seems to be in the perfect fit of mental health. Why is she detained? And so the health inspector wrote back saying she is completely insane and if released will be a danger to certain people's prominent reputations, aka her husband. And so she was transported to a different asylum and she received a lobotomy in 1946. And she was released in 1967. And her son, Tony, noticed that she was a bit off than she was when she came back, or when she left. And so he had a psychiatric evaluation done on her, and the psychiatrist revealed that there was never actually anything wrong with her. These photographic records exist because some influential doctors, including keen photographer Dr. Hugh Diamond, believed that the then new science of photography could help to diagnose mental illness by capturing what he then called the exact point that had been reached in a scale of unhappiness. Wendy Wallace, May 12, 2012. So basically what Wendy Wallace is saying is that by photographing these people, they thought that by looking at the pictures they could tell what type of mental illness they had. So this woman, Emma Riches, was diagnosed with insanity caused by childbirth after being photographed. And this woman, Elizabeth Thu, was diagnosed with epilepsy after being photographed. Now it's very clear that these doctors were not very educated in their field of mental illness. So imagine what these uneducated doctors were doing to these patients that weren't actually insane while they were in an asylum.
Many famous treatments are electroshock therapy, the gyrating chair, and lobotomy. But the two that I stuck with is the gyrating chair that was invented in the 1700s. The gyrating chair was used to shake up the blood and tissues of the body to restore equilibrium, but resulted in bleeding and becoming unconscious. And most of the time when they operated on the patients with the gyrating chair, they would be in dark rooms and it would force their senses to come alive because it was dark, noisy, and it smelled. Another famous invention, or treatment, that, as they called it, was a lobotomy. And a lobotomy, they cut a hole in your skull and they would remove part of your cortex from the brain, and then they would inject ethanol to destroy fibers from the frontal lobe. And this usually resulted in patients having eye problems, bowel problems, increased temperatures, and vomiting. Neurologist Antonio Moniz is credited for inventing the lobotomy. It removes part of your skull and injects ethanol into the brain. A lot of other cruel treatments they used on patients were restraint chairs, straitjackets, strap chairs, isolation cages. They were chained to walls, electroshock therapy, and they would put patients in baths to stop their hysteria. One of the good asylums that I found personally was the West Riding Asylum. It was near Wakefield, and it was the 6th institution of its kind in the United Kingdom. Patients were allowed to have jobs like doing laundry, farming, gardening. They were also allowed to join in leisure activities. Patients were forced to pick clothes out that best fit in a pile in the middle of the room. Daily Mail newspaper, March 19, 2015. Other patients were put in head braces and held up by officers so they could take their pictures and show people from the outside of the asylum the conditions there and that there is nothing to fear, they're completely fine now. This asylum soon banned the use of restraints unless it was absolutely necessary. It also kept sedation to a minimum. But due to funding and overcrowdedness, it led to many patients being killed by disease. 5 of the worst asylums. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, the Athens Lunatic Asylum, Overbrook Insane Asylum, Penhurst Insane Asylum, and Waverly Hills Sanatorium. A lot of these are really bad, but the first one I'm going to talk about is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It was very overcrowded. Doug Johnson described kids lived in cages for their own protection and others. He also described how a violent patient was shackled to metal rings built into the walls so nurses could attend to him without the fear of injury. Washington Post Magazine, October 5, 2008. Many doctors used ice picks when they perform lobotomies, and that's not the right instrument when you perform lobotomies. They also would subject women, or sometimes men, to cold baths to stop their hysteria, but in reality it didn't stop anything at all. The next asylum that I'm going to talk about didn't use ice picks when they performed lobotomies. The Athens Lunatic Asylum. It is also known as the Ridges. It opened in 1874 and closed down in 1993. It tried to use the Kirkbride method, but it failed. They used electroshock therapy and they also performed lobotomies. Many patients would be restrained for days, beaten, kicked, and it became very overcrowded. A patient, a lady, in the middle of the night was trying to escape from a part of an abandoned ward. She died of starvation, and her body was not found until after her body decayed, so it left a permanent corpse stain on the floor. And people that go and visit this asylum today can still see the patient trying to escape at night. The Overbrook Insane Asylum. It was located in Cedar Grove, New Jersey. It opened in 1896 and closed down in 1975. 24 patients in 1917 were left to freeze to death in their beds. After World War II, overcrowding led to 150 patients going missing. January 23, 2013, Complex Magazine. It became overcrowded because the patients that came back from World War II had post-traumatic stress, and their families didn't know what to do with them, so like Dana said earlier, they were just put in asylums because their families didn't know what to do. The Pennhurst Insane Asylum. A journalist with photographic proof exposing the conditions at the Pennhurst Insane Asylum showed that patients were shackled to beds, children confined to cribs, and terrible overcrowding. Betty Potts, a former patient who arrived at Pennhurst at the age of 8, described being tied to her bed and placed in solitary confinement for her screaming tantrums. And she also described that the only way she ever got attention was if she banged her head on the wall repeatedly. Lynn Olson's Paranormal Block. The Pennhurst Insane Asylum was located in Spring City, Pennsylvania. It opened in 1908 and closed down in 1987. It was built to educate and care for the mentally ill. Children were physically and sexually abused by nurses and doctors. And if they bit another patient more than once or twice or even 3 times, their teeth would be forcefully pulled out. Many patients were tied to beds, shackled to walls, and locked in cages. And on average, patients only got 3 minutes of psychiatric care per year. And that's kind of not a lot of care if you think about it. That's not any care at all. So they just left the patients there to defend and care for themselves. How is that treating them? The Waverly Hill Sanatorium. This is by far one of the worst asylums in history. It opened in 1910 and it closed down in 1962. It was home to many tuberculosis patients. And during the 50 years that it was open, there was at least 6,000 deaths. They also used electroshock therapy for treatments. They placed heavy sandbags on their chest, believing that the lungs would expand, and they also did many experimental surgeries. They would remove the ribs and bones and replace them with balloons, again, believing that the lungs would expand. The death tunnel and suicides in room 502. The death tunnel wasn't originally used for the removal of the dead. It was originally used to get supplies during the winter because there was a huge hill that they couldn't get up and over, so people brought them their supplies. But then, after patients started dying, they started removing the dead through it because they didn't want other patients to see their friends or sometimes family members dead. So they would just bring them down through the tunnel and just dispose their bodies. Suicides in room 502. This story stuck out the most to me out of all of them. There are many of them, but this one is by far the saddest in my opinion. A nurse named Mary Lee committed suicide in room 502. She was a signal pregnant nurse who had contracted tuberculosis, Paranormal Association, July 25, 2013. So Mary Lee either got pregnant by a male nurse or a male doctor. They don't know which one. They never found out. She committed suicide because during that time, women would be shunned if they were pregnant and single. So I kind of understand where she's coming from. But the sad reality is that back in those days, we were cruel to people, and it changed over years. So now, many asylums are just now museums or they're torn down. There are no known asylums today.
There are no asylums today. The mentally ill are most often end up in prison, hospitals, or homes, and a lot of times they end up homeless too. Prison. 1 in 6 U.S. prisoners is mentally ill. Many of them suffer from serious illnesses such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. There are 3 times as many men and women with mental illness in U.S. prisoners as in mental health hospitals. Jamie Helmer, half of the mentally ill inmates in state and federal facilities report having 3 or more prior sentences. Bureau of Justice statistics. 16% of all incarcerated individuals reported either a mental condition or an overnight stay in the mental hospital and were identified as mentally ill. Bureau of Justice statistics. In prison, a lot of the mentally ill are either treated bad or good. There's some prisons where they get mentally, physically, and sexually abused. In other prisons, they're treated good. They're trying to hire more people to treat them the correct way, and they're trying to get them to get better. Hospitals, psychiatric ward, there's voluntary and involuntary admission. Voluntary is when you go in there yourself and you admit yourself and you get help that way. If you're involuntary admitted, most of the time it's because you have like a psychiatric say that you're mentally ill, and they put you in there to help you instead of putting you in prison or whatever from a court case. What happens? Group work, individual therapy, personal time, and visitors. Group work is when, like, everybody, they go in a room and they sit around and they talk about the problems, and they meet friends and they get along and whatnot. Individual therapy is when, obviously, you go talk to your psychiatrist, and whatever you don't want to talk about in group time, you talk about there. It helps you a lot to be able to do that. Personal time is when you have your own time, you get to do whatever you want with it. You can go to common areas or whatever that are in the hospital. If you volunteer and admit yourself, you can check yourself out and go to like a park or whatever to get some time alone. Visitors, that's when you have like families or friends come in, and it helps you there because it's familiar, it's what you know. A lot of people do better when they have something there that they know about and that they can help with. Natasha Tracy is somebody who voluntarily admitted herself. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder early on. Right away she said, I would rather die than go to one of those places, Natasha Tracy. But when she got there, they did the group work, they did the personal time, and they did all of that. A lot of times, since she admitted herself, she went to the park together a long time, and that helped her a lot too, being outside. At the end, she said, when I admitted myself, I never thought that I would stay that long. I thought they would keep me from killing myself for a couple of days, and that would be it. But instead, my doctor did want to see an improvement of some sort before I left, Natasha Tracy. So that's one where they helped. Later she left and she wasn't suicidal anymore, so it was weird. Homes type of housing, supervised group housing, partially supervised group housing, support housing, rental housing, home ownership. Supervised group housing is like a nursing home where they have 24/7 care. They have help with their daily tasks. They have people there all the time. It helps. Partially supervised group housing is like assisted living. You don't get left alone for more than 7 hours. If you need somebody, you can call in somebody. It helps a lot. Supportive housing is when like somebody goes to your house like once a week and you talk it out, and it helps. They do go through therapy with you. Rental and home ownership is obviously where you live on your own and you don't need anybody to come and help, but it does help sometimes. I mentioned those two because back in the day, you wouldn't get to live alone if you had ADD or ADHD. You would have had to go into a mental center.
So there's a lot of differences between the old asylums back in the day and the new mental facilities nowadays.
There are many cruel and brutal treatments that didn't help at all.
And the old asylums were very unjust, and the doctors there were very, very uneducated.
But the new ones are good and bad, but they're educated and they are compassionate.
So next time you go around eating 4 hamburgers, just think, you might be insane.